or space to include every single person that we talk to. But I also try and be really transparent with people about how I'm going to be using their story. And sometimes just because my editor decides a story should go in a different direction, or sometimes we start stories that we aren't able to finish, it just unfortunately doesn't quite make it to the final story. But I always try and let people know, you know, this is what happened. This is why you haven't seen your voice. And don't ever think that it's something that you personally did that like caused this to happen. Reporters are kind of balancing all of these different things and deadlines. And feel free to ask the reporter, you know, why wasn't my story included, or where did your story end up, or when can I expect to hear the story? I try and do that proactively, but I think we all get a little busy sometimes, so I always appreciate getting that reminder from folks.
That's great. Yeah, don't take it personal. I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
This is all really led in well into the demystifying the process of talking to the media. So you kind of talked about framing your expectations on your involvement with a story. Is there anything else that a parent or provider might expect when they're approached by a journalist?
So I can speak to me. So I work for a radio station, so you can hear my stories on 89.3 FM, and we also put our stories online at laist.com. And so that means when I'm doing an interview that is a recorded interview for a story, I'm going to ask that people are okay with the interview being recorded, because that's the way I can use it in my story. I might call and talk to people on the phone ahead of time and say, you know, I'm just looking for information right now. And that's kind of a clue that, like, you know, I'm not working on a specific story, but I'm just trying to understand something. And so that would be a different kind of conversation. And then the other thing is that, especially right now in this time when we are all so far apart, in addition to asking you to answer questions or do an interview, I might be asking you, can I have a photographer come take a photo of you? Do you have a photo of yourself that I can include in the story? So those are things to think about ahead of time. If you're working with a television reporter or a newspaper reporter, it might be a little different. They might ask you to be on video. You might just be talking to them on the phone, and they might just be writing things down. So, you know, and you also deserve to know that ahead of time. Like, is this interview for TV? Is it for radio? And usually we don't give people specific questions ahead of time because we want them to be kind of like candid and, you know, not be like reading off of something when they're like giving us an answer. But I can tell you the topics ahead of time. And so that way you can start to think about, you know, what are the 3 main points that I want to communicate in my story. And you can even take some notes for yourself to get ready. And I think Stephanie has some other tips on how you might practice too.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I did in my previous role before working for KPCC was working with community members to get people ready to tell their story to the media. So a lot of what we do is what Mariana just said. You think about, okay, if I'm only going to be in a tiny chunk of this story, if maybe they take just one quote from me, what do I want that to be? What do I want my main point to get across in this story to be? And one thing that is helpful is to practice with a friend, with a colleague, with somebody who can kind of listen to you. Maybe you're just talking about your own life. If you feel super comfortable and open about talking about your story, then, you know, you might just feel free to talk with the reporter directly right away. If you're a person that is not used to doing that kind of thing, then it's helpful to just bounce it off somebody and to have them tell you back, like, oh, you know what was really interesting about what you said? This, and this. You know, this is, I think, these are the pieces that I think you should really focus on. And that just makes it a little bit easier for you when you actually talk to the reporter, kind of like you can kind of deal with the nerves a little bit in advance and feel more comfortable when you're actually on air.
That's really good tips to know what is important to you, what you want to get across. So having that in your mind, having those points is good. I like that you mentioned that to practice. And practice talking and answering questions, and to somebody that you know and trust. I thought those are good tips as well. It also reminds me of the movie Zootopia, when the reporter asks you a question and you don't want to answer that question, you restate the question and then ask a different question and answer the question that you wanted. I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, I think,
like
I mean,
that.
the important thing to know is that when you're being interviewed, the reporter will have all types of questions for you, but you are in complete control of what you answer. So whatever it is that you would like to get across, you can talk about that. So the idea is like, you're listening to the curiosity of the reporter. You want to, you want to address the questions that they're asking. If they're asking you something that makes you feel really uncomfortable, you don't have to answer that. You can either say, I don't want to answer that, or you can say, that's a really good question. And what I really want to talk about today is, whatever it is you really want to talk about. That
is really a good tip. And that's also good for personal relationships as well, I think. All right, let's move on to the learning about your rights and talking with a journalist. There's just some basic things about First Amendment and kind of what you guys know all the time, but maybe not all of us are aware of if we aren't in this field. When you are interviewed for a story, are you able to have final approval of the story? Can you ask to see it before it gets published or aired?
So the answer to that is no. And the reason for that is that I conduct myself and I do my work and my interviews. I try to do them the same way for everyone that I talk to, whether that's the governor, whether that's a city council member, the mayor, a teacher, a parent, a 5-year-old. And the reason for that is that if we allowed people to review stories before they aired, it would give them more control over the final story. So when it comes to like accountability reporting, if you were to ask a public official about how money was misspent, for example, or, how, employees that might have been mistreated, you wouldn't necessarily want that public official to be able to go back and say, well, no, that's, I didn't do that, or not I didn't do that, but, for them to be able to revise their answer after the fact. And so that's why you really want to, be intentional and take the time to think about your answers. And then the other thing I want to really make important too is that I want my stories to be as correct as possible. Because what happens when there's a factual error in a story is that we make a correction. We make a correction on air, we put a correction online, and I hate seeing corrections next to my name, because to me, that means I did not do a good job in like my main purpose, which is to like report the truth. And so if I have, any unsureness about what someone has told me, I double check with them, because I don't want that correction. That's a point of pride in the work that I do, that when you hear my story on the radio or that you read it on LAist, that I have worked extremely hard to make sure that everything is accurate. When I finish a story, I go back and I look at all the facts, all the ages of people, the way their names are spelled, the year they said they started their business, and I highlight them and I make sure that I can trace them back to either an interview or something that I read. And so journalists that you talk to really do want to get your story right.
Are you the fact checker, or is there somebody on your staff that does that?
So for the most part, I am fact checking my own stories. My stories also, I work with an editor. So after I write my story, an editor looks over my story and might have questions about specific facts. And then usually it's on me though to go and double check the facts. Other reporters, maybe who work at like magazines or like do longer form reporting, there actually are specific people whose like job title is fact checker, and they're going to be getting on the phone and asking you like, oh, what year was your daughter born, or, all those like little nitty gritty details. But for the most part, I'm the one that's doing the fact checking on my stories.
Okay. Really shortly, we're going to have time for Q&A for our attendees. So if you have questions you'd like to ask, why don't you go ahead and type them into the chat, and then we'll get to those in very short order. So I want to make sure you have time to ask your questions. The next thing, what can I do if my story isn't accurate, if I don't feel that it's accurate?
So that's basically my nightmare. But there is a solution to that. If you feel like there is a factual error in your story and you can back that up, please tell the reporter. Email them, call them. I mean, I would hope that you would, like, everyone is entitled to their own feelings. I would hope that you try and do it in a respectful way. But we want to hear if there's an error in the story, because we want the story to be correct. And if you feel that a reporter has been unresponsive to what you've said, you can ask to speak to the editor, or you can check online and see who the editor might be. But speaking for myself, I always try to be really responsive when people ask for corrections, because it hurts my integrity as a reporter when there's something inaccurate in my story.
Okay. Can a person expect to get paid, or to be interviewed, or to pay you to cover something that they want to hear?
Nope, no monetary exchanges happen with any of our reporting.
Okay.
And I think Isaac put in a question here, what is off the record? So that might be a term you've heard on television, but off the record is a real thing. Essentially what off the record means in terms of journalism is that whatever information that you are telling a reporter will not be published or shared, and your name will not be attached to it. But off the record is a mutual agreement that a source makes with a reporter ahead of time. And so you don't want to like call someone up and like divulge a bunch of like sensitive information and then say like, oh, by the way, that's off the record. That should be the first thing that you're establishing as part of a conversation. And what off the record allows reporters to do is to try and look and see if there's another way that we can get that information. So for example, if you were telling us about, you know, maybe some funding that you felt like you were entitled to from the city of LA, and you have this email that says, oh, like such and such was supposed to get this funding or something like that, that allows me to like go to that agency and say, have you been distributing this funding? And so the goal is to be able to get that information confirmed by another source. But sometimes, you know, people aren't necessarily wanting to be forthcoming about that kind of stuff. And so that's what allows us to do that. Another thing I want to distinguish too is something called on background. On background is kind of like another level, which is that you're providing information to a reporter, and they might use that information in a story, but they're not going to attach your name to it. And I just want to say too that both of those types of agreements tend to be more rare. Mostly we want to be able to have information that has been shared, like, you know, totally above board. We can like attach your name to it because that just helps like the credibility of the story. But sometimes those other methods are ways for us to learn about a more sensitive topic that, you know, that maybe we wouldn't be able to learn about otherwise.
And I would also add that it's probably good practice to just assume that you're on the record when you're talking to a journalist because of that mutual agreement. So, of course there's a relationship of trust, but it's nice to just kind of think consciously about what you're talking about with the journalist, even if it's casual.
Cool. Well, I think there's one more question in here. What are some ways to get a journalist's attention?
Yeah, so I think we have a tip sheet to hand out that has all of our contact information on it, but all the usual ways you would contact your friends. We're on social media. We're available via email, via phone. I think for me, email tends to be the best way, because sometimes if you call me, I might be doing something like this or like in another interview, and so I might not get that phone call. So find me on social media. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. You know, if you're in groups that you think reporters should be paying attention to, that's another way that like we can make sure that we're, you know, paying attention to the community that you belong in. And also don't be shy about following up. If you send us something and you don't hear from us for some reason, feel free to check back in. There's really no way to overdo it. And even if, you know, you send me a really great idea that I just can't get to because I'm only one person and all these crazy things are happening in the world right now, I at least want to acknowledge that, like, I'm really appreciative whenever people take the time to get in touch.
And I would say a big part of my job too is trying to find ways to get community voices into the newsroom. So there are a number of ways, if you're specifically interested in contacting anyone at KPCC and Elias, that you can get involved. So if you go to any of the reporters' bios on our website, you'll see at the bottom that there's a box, and that box says something like, what questions do you have about early childhood that you think that we should cover? And reporters are actually, in our newsroom, are tasked with having a certain percentage of their stories come from these community-generated questions. So, so we pay attention to every single one of those, and that's a really good way to talk to people. And then I think, as Mariana was saying, direct email, personal email is nice, and people want to hear from you. Sometimes you think, oh, they're a reporter, they're doing something important far away, but they would much rather hear from like people on the ground, on the front lines, parents, childcare providers, than just getting like a press release.
Okay, well, great. And thank you for putting your information in the chat. So folks, if you're on, you can see that. So thank you both today for coming and spending some time with us. I do have a second poll that I'm going to launch. This is after this conversation today. Do you feel more comfortable with the prospect of speaking to a journalist? And let's see, you have some moments to respond.
And while people are responding, you can see that I put into the chat a link here. So this is a link to a kind of cheat sheet about how to talk to journalists. It's got a bunch of these sort of like common questions that you would have about talking to a reporter. And it also has our contact information on it. So please click there and download it.
Okay, great. And then also in our follow-up, when we send a survey, we can send the flyer that you guys made. So it's really nice, a lot of good information. All right, so the end of our poll, pretty good, guys. 91% feel more comfortable. So I think that's a win. And you know, 9% maybe they feel more comfortable. I'll take that as a win as well. So thank you guys for participating in that, and thank you for sharing that information with us. As we conclude, I don't want to leave out the census. It's super important for everyone to be counted. It counts for your family, your community, and our children. And so you can do that online at my2020census.gov, or you all, by now, if you haven't done it that way, you will also have a paper form that you can fill out. But it's really important that our communities count, and want to make sure that you have that information as well. So this is my information if you need to reach me for any reason. And you know, if you have other ideas or feedback, we would love to hear that. And we want to continue to grow our Community Voices membership and invite you to all things Community Voices. So let me know that you're interested in getting more involved, and we will add you to the list when things come up. So I want to thank Mariana and Stephanie today, and I want to thank my coworker Isaac for being there on the technical side, and thank you all of my good old friends. Let me see, what do I do? I wanted to go back to show
to the Zoom. Just click on it.
I just wanted to see everybody. So much for that. We were almost flawless until the end, trying to be fancy. So much for that. Anyway, I want to thank you all for coming. And I see some of my friends out there. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I will see you in a couple weeks when we try this again on a new topic. So thank you for coming, and that is the end.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Nice to meet you guys.
And
Let's see. And then
you ended.